This is Jim with Twisted Hobbies, and today we're building the Jabberwocky. Okay, we are ready to get started on the Jabberwocky. First thing, I have my manual that I downloaded from the website. I have my power combo, which consists of my prop, my motor, my ESC, and all of my servos. We have extra servos for flaps, which is going to be real fun. I've got my receiver, and I've got a fresh tube of foam tack ready to rumble. So let's get started into the build. Okay, we're going to take everything out of the box, put the hardware kit aside. On these wings, they are profile wings, so you want to be careful when folding them over. I do want to loosen them up a little bit, but we don't want to really put a lot of weight on them because it'll crack them. I do fold over the rudder, and then we're going to get started onto the wheels. We're going to put the two halves of the hubs together and then attach them with the bolt and nut, set them aside, and then we're going to move on to the wing. I put some parchment paper down because you don't want to glue this to the table. Apply a healthy amount of foam tack between them, press them together, then pull them apart for a few minutes, and then when you press them back together, it will give them a permanent bond. Then I go back and fill in any tiny little cracks here or there, and it's perfect. Next up is the inserts for the nylon bolts to go through. And then we are going to start onto our slots. We have a slot on the top and bottom for the wing spar. I'll be using the slot cutter that I got from Twisted Hobbies. I have it set to 2 millimeters deep, and then I just get the straight edge in place and make sure it's not going to be slanted. It's going to be parallel with the front of the wing. Then you just run it down, and then we're going to do a dry fit to make sure it fits all the way in. And then on this, I used CA glue to get it into place because I didn't want to take it back out of here and then fill it with foam tack. So I just filled it in. Next, I'm going to flip the wing over, so I need another piece of parchment paper or wax paper so that way it doesn't stick to the table. And then we're going to repeat the same process one more time. And I'm using this screwdriver here to help me push it all the way down into the slot, so that way it's even the whole way. Then we fill it with CA, and then we're ready to start on the electronics. Usually I have a board that organizes all these, but since there's 6 servos for all the flaps and stuff, I just set them all out. So what I'm doing here is zeroing out all of the servos, verifying motor direction, calibrating the ESC, and just getting all the electronics ready to install. So now that I have the servos all sorted, I'm going to start with the servo extensions. To do this, we're going to drill a little hole through the servo arm, and then we are going to use a little screw to attach them to the servo horns. Next up, I'm going to be cutting a slot for the wires of the servos to run down and then feed into the middle of the fuselage, so that way they'll be neat and tidy. So now we're ready to install each of the servos, and if you see, I place the servo into the pocket, I press it down, and then that shows me where the little tabs are, and then I cut the tabs in with the X-Acto, and then I can push it all the way in. Some people choose to use hot glue. I just use foam tack on the sides, and it seems to hold the servos in just fine. If you do need to replace one, it's not a big deal to just cut it back out. So make sure those are level with the foam all the way across. And then you see me running the wires into the slot all the way to the middle of the wing. And next up, we're going to be putting the control horns on for the flaps and the ailerons. Okay, those are all glued into place. Now here is where I made a pretty big mistake. There are 4 bolts here, and we're supposed to take 2 of those and cut them in half. I decided to do it on all of them, and that bit me a little bit later. So make sure you only do it to 2 of those, and then we're going to use those for the push rods for the ailerons and the flaps. So then we can thread on the clevises. And when you are checking the length on these, make sure that you pull the flaps up so they're even with the middle part of that wing and the ailerons as well. That way you can get a good neutral position. Then once I got one of those looking really good, I was able to make the rest of them the same length. And as you get here, I would recommend not squeezing those pins to their final all the way through position. Just get them enough so that they are able to hold, because you don't want to have to pull it back out and then adjust it. Okay, next up is going to be cutting out and installing the side force generators. And they have a up and down on them, so make sure you're putting them on the right direction. They also have a couple little tiny holes to help you line up the trailing edge of the wing with the appropriate place for it, so that helps a lot. Then we're going to cut out the wing fences and the antylizer. The wing fences go onto the top of the wing. There's a little dotted line that shows you on the graphics where they go, so that's really helpful. And I didn't measure these to make them parallel, I just put them on. Then the antylizer just goes in the middle. Next up, we're going to be moving on to the elevator. So I get all of the parts out of the hardware kit, and then I cut these parts off, get rid of the little piece in the middle, and then we're going to cut apart the white tube supports. These innermost supports have little tabs on them, that way you know they go there, and then the other two look a little different as well. So I glue those on, and then we're going to dry fit the rest of the pieces together. This little piece didn't quite sit together, so I had to cut it so it would be flush. Did that on both sides. That's why we do the dry fit, just to make sure everything's coming together as we expect. Then add some glue, put in the supports, and set it aside to dry. Make sure you didn't get any glue in areas that it doesn't belong, because you don't want this to end up getting stuck together. Then we're going to put CA along the tube, but only on those outer parts. It needs to swivel through the middle part. Then we're going to attach our servo horn and install the servo. I realized here that the control horn for the elevator needs to be on the other side, so I cut a little slit and then rotated it up to the top side. Then I glued in the servo, and then I made the push rod for the elevator, just as we did for the flaps and ailerons. Okay, next up we're going to attach that push rod to our elevator control horn and our servo horn. Looks like it's in place. Now we're going to move on to the balsa plywood substructure. Pop all those pieces out. I'm going to sand up any of the little edges that are still poking out, and then we're going to start assembly. Right off the bat here, I did make a mistake. These C-shaped pieces on the side here, they need to go onto each of the sides first before I start doing any other assembly. I do like doing my assembly right on top of those side pieces, because that way everything lines up. Just make sure you do those little C-shaped pieces on there first. Some of the parts need to be doubled up, like this part here on the landing gear, that gets doubled up. And then we're going to put in the threaded inserts for that piece, and then for one more piece coming up. And right here I'm gluing on the thrust angle shims for the firewall. And then I start attaching all of that together. One more threaded insert. And this is where I realized that that needs to go in there. I did have enough room to sneak it in, but again, that should have been done right off the bat in the very beginning. Okay, now I'm able to put it all together. And then I'm going to apply CA along every mating surface. And then I'll go back and do the corners just a little bit more. Once I'm done adding CA, then I will put some weight on it and we'll let it all dry. Next up, we're heading to the fuselage. So I'm going to cut apart these pieces. And then we're going to affix these strips down to the cowl of the plane. And you'll see here that I chose to use CA and kicker for this. Usually on a foam to foam connection I use foam tack, but in this case I needed it to adhere quickly because I'm going to be bending it and I just didn't have the time to wait for the foam tack to set up to do that. I found a little piece of PVC that happens to be the right size, and then I just used some batteries to kind of fold it over. Now we're going to glue the plywood substructure to the plane itself, and I just use a pencil to mark off where I shouldn't be putting glue right now, and then I'm going to put glue everywhere else, and then affix the sides of the fuselage. Same thing on the other side, and then I pile just a bunch of batteries on top of it to hold it together while it dries. Next up is going to be the top and bottom of the fuselage. So I get these spacers in between the halves, and then I can put on the bottom. I did a dry fit there to make sure everything looked good. Load it up with some foam tack and press it into place. Same thing with the top section. And then we're going to put on the tail skid. And this is another instance where I think it's a better idea to use CA and kicker rather than foam tack, because we want this to be an instant bond and we can make sure that that's instantly done. So I used the CA on the wood piece, spray some kicker on the foam, and then fold it over, and then it immediately tacks together. Now we're going to be moving on to the cowling, and in order to do this, we put on some foam tack, we let it set up, and then I'm going to come at it with a utility knife, because that's got a bit of a longer blade than the X-Acto, and we're going to take off the corner of it all the way around. And then I'm going to smooth it out with some sandpaper. I'm going to be using 150 grit because it's what I have handy, and that does a great job of smoothing it all out. Then we can move on to our windscreen. For this I put CA onto the wood part, kicker onto the foam part, and do the same on the other side. And then I'll go back through and do the bottom of the windscreen. And then once that's finalized, we're going to move on to the elevator and rudder. So we're going to go ahead and use some extensions on the servo wires to get them all the way up to the receiver. I could have gone with some shorter ones than these, but it's fine. I'm not too worried about the weight on the longer extension. So I'm going to fish these all the way through, and then I'm able to glue on the horizontal stabilizer and elevator. Pretty straightforward here with the dry fit, and then applying glue. Just make sure it's seated all the way, and then we can apply the rudder and vertical stabilizer as well. Then we'll find our rudder control horn and glue it into place. Then it's about here where I realized I made a big mistake. I actually cut one of the bolts that I was supposed to keep, so I need to figure out something else for my push rod on my rudder. So I had some spare carbon fiber pieces that I was able to use, and I also had a spare adjustable end link that I used on the servo horn, and then everything was great. For you, you're going to thread on the clevis ends onto your threaded rod, adjust it to length, and snap it into place. So I gave myself some extra work here. Yours will be much more straightforward, exactly how we did the ailerons and the flaps. And then our final step on this section is to glue the elevator control horn in place, and you just want to be very careful that you're not getting glue anywhere else but on that control horn. Now we're going to unscrew the wheel hub halves, apply some CA, and then put those back together so that they get a final glue up. Then we're going to drill out our holes in our landing gear, and I'm sorry I did this just out of frame off the edge of the table. But once those are drilled, we'll be able to assemble the landing gear. And the key here is to get them tight enough that they're holding, but loose enough that they're spinning. Once we get that set, we'll glue it in place. I just use a little bit of CA on the end of those, and then we will screw the landing gear onto the bottom of the fuselage. Next up, we'll be installing the electronics. I'm going to feed it all through. I'm going to attach the prop adapter, and then I will screw the motor into the firewall. And then we'll plug in our elevator and rudder into our receiver. And then next up is going to be the propeller, but I forgot to balance it. So I put it on the balancer, and guess what? It's perfectly balanced already. I didn't need to do anything on this one. I love this little balancer from Twisted Hobbies. It works fantastic. Now we're going to put the wing on the plane, and to do that I'm going to need a Y cable, and I'm going to attach that to the ailerons, and then I'll plug in the flaps, and then screw it all together. This completes the build on the Jabberwocky. Okay, let's take a look at installing the bush landing gear. First thing I need to do is uninstall my previous landing gear. I'm going to take those off. I'm going to take off the wheels. Then I'm going to take the axles out of the wheels, and then we will install the kneeling part of the landing gear onto the previous landing gear. So the tighter that you make this connection, the more resistance it gives. So it's kind of a balance trying to find the right amount of give. We do this on each side. And then I noticed I still had a fair amount of wiggle in there, so I put some CA glue onto the gear itself, so that way it fixed it in place. And that seemed to do a really nice job. Then we're going to put in the new axles, and then mount the wheels onto the kneeling section of the landing gear. From there, I'm going to put in the little angle block so that it angles forward a little, and we're going to reuse the attachments for the previous landing gear that go over the top of that block. Okay, got it all together. That needs to get adjusted a little bit, and it seems to work great. For a maiden flight, I'm typically looking to make sure that the plane is in trim and that everything is operating as I expect it would. But right off the bat, the plane was flying fantastic. As soon as I got it up, it just wanted to start doing aileron rolls. And here I'm playing with the flaps. I have the flaps set up so they can go up or down. So that way, when I flip it over and fly it upside down, I can have the flaps the other direction and really slow it down. So it's a super fun plane. It's really agile. It's got lots of power, ready to rumble. I could have given it a shot with some elevator trim, but really it didn't need anything because I had all the surfaces zeroed before I took off, and it flew just perfectly with that. Really well balanced, slows down nicely, still is quite aerobatic. It's such a fun plane. I'm flying it here on a 3S 8500 milliamp hour battery. It seems to balance it really nicely. I got about 5 minutes of flight time out of that. You could put a bigger battery in there, but then it's going to fly a little faster, a little heavier, and you'll have more inertia with it. So I like it being nice and floaty. So hopefully this build video has helped you to build your Jabberwocky, and hopefully you have as much fun with it as I am.